So, shall we continue Bishul?
Absolutely, let's do it.
So last time we ended off talking about making tea with an essence, and we ended up with the question, what should we be doing first, pouring in the water or the essence? So are there any things we have to be careful once we pour out the hot water from the urn?
What this comes down to is the question of how to look at a kli sheni. As we mentioned, the Gemara says, kli Rishon מבשל, kli Sheni אינו מבשל. But we also noted that sometimes kli sheni does cook, and we have to be weary that maybe something would be considered kali habishul, that it cooks even into a kli sheni. But the Mishabura notes that when we have two chumras together, two issues where we're taking a more strict opinion. In this case, one of them being that we have to be worried about kli sheni cooking. The second being, as we talked about 2 shiurim ago, that a davar lach shenitztanin, a liquid that cools down, can have bishul take place again. That is two chumras that we don't have to apply together. And therefore, if you have a liquid that was previously cooked but now cooled down, even though we said you can't put it back on the fire, you can put it into a kli sheni. And so the Mishabura says, if you cook up the tea essence, you cook up the tea leaves, and now you have cold tea essence, you can take a kli sheni with hot water from the urn and take that cold essence and pour it in, and then you'll have your nice warm tea. The Mishabura notes that if one wanted to avoid this issue completely, one could really just keep the tea essence hot over Shabbos, and then you can certainly put it into a kli sheni, because you could really even put it into a kli Rishon, because the hot essence never cooled down and there is no bishul problem. Those are the two solutions the Mishabura gives. One should note, a word of caution, if the way you keep your essence warm is by keeping it on top of the urn on Shabbos, if you take it off to pour it into your cup, make sure to put it back on quickly, because then it could cool down, and now we're going to have a problem because you're putting cooled down tea essence on top of the urn, and that would be an issue of cooking up a cold liquid.
So we did mention last video that there's a few things that don't get cooked in a kli sheni like water, so let's just make it a little bit clearer over here. What does get cooked and what doesn't get cooked in a kli sheni?
It does seem to be that it's specifically water that wouldn't be a problem in a kli sheni, and therefore, let's say you want to make warm water for a baby bottle. So you could take very hot water in a kli sheni and pour cold water out of the sink into that hot water, because it's a kli sheni already, and a kli sheni does not cook water. However, it seems to be that tea, which has flavor, would be potentially a problem of cooking in a kli sheni, if not for the fact that we're combining two chumras together, as we mentioned earlier. But technically speaking, would be a problem. This becomes very relevant to milk. Let's say one wants to pour cold milk into their hot tea. Apparently that's how the Brits drink their tea. So let's say you want to make your tea that way. Is that a problem? Because milk perhaps would be cooking in a kli sheni. So the Mishabura notes that if the milk is previously cooked, once again, that would be permitted to put in a kli sheni. This leads to a machlokas amongst the contemporary poskim, how to look at pasteurized milk, because pasteurized milk goes through a very brief boiling process. Is that considered cooked or not? That's a machlokas of poskim, whether you could rely on kli sheni for pasteurized milk.
So we did mention last week that there's actually a machloket about a kli shlishi between the Mishnah Berurah and Reb Moshe. Is that machloket a clear cut where the Mishnah Berurah holds that there is bishul and kli shlishi?
That's what it sounds like, because the Mishnah Berurah goes to that length to describe how to make tea, as we just talked about. However, the Mishnah Berurah does apply the concept of kli shlishi to the issue of bishul achar afia, when you're cooking something that was previously baked, like putting your bread in hot soup. And the Mishnah Berurah notes that if your soup is in a kli shlishi, and he actually also adds that it can be considered a kli shlishi alone by simply using the ladle to take it out of a kli rishon, and then you put it into your bowl. The ladle becomes a kli sheni, and the bowl a kli shlishi. That issue about a ladle is not so simple, but that the Mishnah Berurah assumes, again, for this context, that it's a kli shlishi. And therefore, in that case, he says you can put the bread into your soup. We should note, not everyone agrees about that ladle assumption. The Mishnah Berurah himself, when discussing a ladle alone, without the bishul achar afia issue, assumes a ladle does not take on the status of a kli sheni to make the next thing a kli shlishi. And also, some argue with the Mishnah Berurah and disagree with the concept of kli shlishi completely. And according to them, even the soup in the bowl would be a problem. But again, Moshe holds that kli shlishi is okay. The Mishnah Berurah holds that a kli shlishi, in this context where we're being machmir about bishul achar afia, is okay. But for tea, he says that one should make tea essence.
Great. So you mentioned pouring cold milk into hot water. What about coffee or preparing anything with hot water and dissolving or a powdery substance in it that kind of gets cooked?
If we're dealing with instant coffee, then instant coffee is permitted because it goes through a roasting and cooking process before you have it at your table and put it into your hot water. And the rule is, ein bishul achar bishul b'davar yavesh. As we talked about, when you have something dry that is previously cooked, it is not a violation of bishul to cook it again. Now, even though here it gets dissolved and becomes a liquid, we follow what it is at the time that it's mixed the water, and at the time that it's mixed with the water, it is a solid, and therefore there is no bishul issue. The Mishabura does mention, when he's talking about sugar, that if something gets completely dissolved, one should be machmir in a kli rishon. It's not clear exactly what this is, but suffice it to say, Rav Moshe Feinstein explains that anything that's completely dissolved, one should be weary about using it in a kli rishon, and so one should put it into a kli sheni. So you can make the instant coffee not in the pot that was on the fire, but certainly in the kli sheni where you pour it out of that pot. It would be okay to make the instant coffees and the instant teas. Now, if we're talking about coffee beans that are just go through a roasting process, but not the instant coffee, which goes through a subsequent bishul process, now we have an issue of bishul after kliya, after roasting. It goes through a previous process and now goes through a different process. As we've noted, we're machmir. The poskim also note that we're not sure exactly if it gets fully roasted in the initial roasting, and so one would think one should be machmir if we're talking about roasted beans. However, as we noted, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, anytime you're in a kli shlishi, there's nothing to worry about. So according to Rav Moshe, it would be permitted, as you can even put raw things in a kli shlishi. According to those who disagree with Rav Moshe, one should probably be strict about making that type of coffee as well. And as far as putting milk in your coffee, that goes back to the discussion we just had before regarding the tea. If it's pasteurized, that's a bit of a machlokas whether you could put it into a kli sheni. So one would have to be makel on that question to put it in a kli sheni. According to Rav Moshe, kli shlishi is always fine.
Okay, great. So let's go back to the question we ended up in the previous video. What do we do first? First, we put in the powder, the essence, and then we pour in the water, or first pour in the hot water, and then on top of that, add the essence or the powder.
What you're getting into is how to look at when you pour from one cup to another. So that's actually a machlokas Rishon. When you take a kli Rishon and now you pour into another cup, is that water that hits the food in the second cup, is that water a kli Rishon because it came from a kli Rishon, or is that water already a kli sheni because it's now in the kli sheni? That's actually machlokas, and there's really a third opinion, which seems to be how we paskin, that it's only a kli Rishon for the kedei klipa, for the first layer of the food that it hits in the second cup. It's considered a kli Rishon, and beyond that, it doesn't cook further. That's how the Mishabura explains the psak of the Shulchan Aruch, that you cannot pour onto raw spices on Shabbos. What this means is usually when you're pouring, you have to contend with that hot water retaining the status of the original kli. So if it's usher in a kli Rishon, you can't pour from a kli Rishon. If it's usher in a kli sheni, you can't pour from a kli sheni. One interesting exception, poskim note, Rav Moshe Feinstein notes, is let's say a baby bottle. If you want to heat up a baby bottle, so normally you can't pour out of a kli Rishon. However, since the bottle is the klipa, the bottle is the outer layer, and there's no bishul issue on the plastic bottle, you're allowed to heat up a baby bottle by pouring directly from the urn, directly from the kli Rishon onto the bottle, because that layer is not an issue of bishul, and beyond that, it wouldn't be considered a kli Rishon.
Okay, so that's the whole inyan of what we call kli Rishon and kli sheni, and we'll have to finish off this topic next week and continue from there into the other issues of Bishul Beshabbos.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward.
Shkoyach, wonderful, and we'll talk next week.
For more short and fast-paced talking Torah clips, make sure to check out our YouTube channel.